I mentioned at the beginning of the course that Dr. Racket is an interpreter, and so you know there must be an interp function in there somewhere. In fact, Racket gives you access to the interp function to some degree through the eval function. Eval actually combines what we would call parse with interp. So I can say eval on an S expression, like +1, 2, and I get the same result as if I had typed that +1, 2 directly in. Eval calls the same interpreter. I could also eval something like create a function, takes an x and adds x to itself, and apply that to 3, and of course I would get a 6 back. When we're forming S expressions, they don't have to be literal things with quote. We could use back quote to escape. For example, I could define an op variable that holds the symbol plus, and then eval with a back quote instead of a regular quote that lets me escape with a comma. That operator 1 and 2. And what happens here is we get a 3 because using a back quote like this escaped back out and gave us the same thing as +1, 2. Of course, this is somewhat silly. I could always define op to be just the plus function and apply op to 1 and 2. But sometimes you have forms where you want to vary things that are not expressions, such as I could have the name for a definition, and I could eval define escape to the name to pick a name, bind that to 2, and you see I've ended up defining x as 2. So the existence of eval can be pretty powerful, but it turns out you probably shouldn't use it. It's more often abused than used correctly. Here's an example of a bad use of eval. I've got a 3 times function, which takes a function name and an argument expression, and it just builds up an application of the function to the function to the function applied to the argument. So if I call 3 times with the name square root and the S expression 256, that's the same as evaluating square root of square root of square root of 256. Of course, what you should really do instead of 3 times like this using eval is just have 3 times take a function and a value for the argument and apply the function 3 times to the arguments. That works just fine in Racket because functions are first-class values. Here's a less trivial example where we're using eval to do something that you can't do by just passing a name around. In this case, I wanted a get function that takes a symbol like x and gets the corresponding field out of posin, where normally we would get a field out of a posin using posin-x or posin-y. And let's say, for whatever reason, I don't want to write posin-, I just want to write an x and pass it to get. Then you could imagine taking that symbol, turning it to a string, combining it with posin-, turning that back into a symbol, evaluating that to get the getter function, and this would actually apply posin-x to that particular posin. So this is a less silly example of eval, but still probably a better way to do this would be to have a get macro, and we'll come back to this example later today. Here's a use of eval that just doesn't even work. So suppose you wanted to explore this expression minus xy, where x varies between 1 and 3 and y varies between 1 and 3. Then you can imagine passing that quoted expression in and mapping over x values and y values and trying to evaluate the expression. This won't work because when you call eval, its call to interp inside is effectively starting with an empty environment. It doesn't see the variables y and x. It's like you're starting a whole program every time you call eval. And so you would get eval would say undefined x in this case. It turns out the environment's not exactly empty, but we'll come back to that in the next section on namespaces. Instead, here's an example, a variant of make table that does work, where we call eval and we build up a let expression that binds x to we escape to get in the value for this x, and similarly escape to get the value for this y, locally bind it in the quoted world, and now when x minus xy is put in here, it'll see this x and this y, which we've escaped to put the values in. So that will work, but again, it's much better to just use a function. Pass make table a function that takes x and y, and then just call it in here directly. And finally, here's another reason why eval is bad, not only because it could be written more succinctly using functions, but here's a case where I have a locally defined function and I try to pass in that function name to 3 times. And for the same reason we just saw, this isn't going to work. When the name double goes in here, eval is starting with an empty environment, and so it can't see the double that was bound way out here. So again, what you should just do is 3 times the take of function, and then it's perfectly fine to pass a locally bound function in to 3 times that way. There's power in eval, and I'm going to use it later to illustrate a few things about syntax objects and macros, but the first rule of eval is don't use eval.